Darkest Dungeon is a roguelite with roots deeply cemented in Lovecraftian storytelling. I would venture to say it's the best Lovecraftian game ever made. It is definitely one of the only ones to ever successfully execute on the core pillars of the Lovecraftian genre, without the devices used being painfully obvious as to what they were trying to do. The Darkest Dungeon is widely regarded as a masterpiece to those who have spent any large amount of time with it, and that is quite a feat coming from a developer who has never done anything previously. Darkest Dungeon is an experience about someone who has been corrupted by an ancient Lovecraftian evil, and your quest to right the wrongs done by your ancestor. I'll need to cover the aspects of the game in order for us to understand exactly what this game has done, and how it has done it. First, I'll need to cover the story of the game and its main details from start to finish. If you don't want to be spoiled on this game, then this is your warning. Then, I will need to talk about the gameplay in its different stages. Start, the evolution from novice to veteran, and finally, the change from veteran to lunatic. By the end of this video, I hope to give you a deeper understanding of the Darkest Dungeon universe, and most importantly, that you understand I wasn't talking about your ancestor when I said someone had been corrupted. The story of Darkest Dungeon is one of death and madness. While I think most people who love this game would agree that the story is not the most important part of what makes this game have staying power, the themes the story exudes permeates every aspect of the gameplay. The tone of the story is set as you boot up the game for the very first time, and that tone will be reinforced each and every time you boot up the game after that. The very first line of dialogue you will hear over and over again.
Ruin has come to our family.
And so it truly has. Your ancestor, the man who is speaking, tells you in a letter how the ruin has come to pass. While the ancestor was the proprietor of the manor, he spent his time indulging in worldly pleasures, drink, flesh, and more. He partook in these activities until they no longer satiated his hunger. His fixations then transitioned from worldly pleasure to unworldly power. Whispers and rumblings had made their way into his ears of a gateway deep below the manor. This gateway held behind it an immense and unknowable power. He went on to devote all of his remaining resources to unearthing the truth behind the terrible secrets that shielded his goals from him. After many years of searching and most of his fortune spent, he did find what he was looking for, and it cost him dearly. He described what he experienced in that terrible place as an ancient evil. The evil that had been slumbering there now stirred. It laid claim to the lives of all who set foot in its terrible soils. Your ancestor was the only one who even made it out, and while he was able to return to the manor, he wasn't exempt from the Darkest Dungeon's toll. This is the prologue of the game, and if you knew nothing else about Darkest Dungeon, just hearing this prologue would give you a strong sense of what the game is about. In the first couple minutes, there are already several gruesome deaths and proliferating madness. When your ancestor talks about the dungeon, he describes it as one would describe a nightmare, terrifying and horrible, if not overly embellished. This letter is his final message, and it was addressed to you. He ends it with a call to action, asking you to subscribe to my channel. Asking you to purge the manor of the corruption his nefarious deeds have brought. This is the foundation for your actions in the game. You will go around to different key locations surrounding the manor and purge them of the evil brought about by opening the Darkest Dungeon. Before I can talk any more directly about Darkest Dungeon, I want to cover its inspirations, the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Some of you may not have ever heard of H.P. Lovecraft, or know very little about his works, even if you've been exposed to them in some form. There will be some easily digestible explanations and references to recognizable modern characters. I'm sure at least some, if not most, of you have heard of Lovecraft, potentially knowing a great deal more than myself. And for you, I will be discussing details that matter with regards to Darkest Dungeon, so we can understand how the genre enhances Darkest Dungeon specifically. H.P. Lovecraft is the father of Lovecraftian horror genre. Cosmic beings like Cthulhu and other less popular horrors like Azathoth. And by less popular, I mean less known by the public, not less liked. I personally love my blind idiot god. The core of what it is to be Lovecraftian is the horrors. Everything in Lovecraft centers around these cosmic horrors. I say cosmic, and for those of you who don't understand what I mean cosmic literally. The most accurate depictions of these horrors show them as floating in space, as big or bigger than most planets. These horrors are capital H horrors. The mere act of looking at them is enough to ensure you go insane. They are said to be unkillable, but for the most part, that's only kind of true. There are three main classes of horrors: Elder Gods, Great Old Ones, and Outer Gods. While they are generally unkillable, it is a misconception to say they can't be killed. I bring this up because killing these creatures is generally seen as bullshit by Lovecraftian fans, but I want to discuss it because it's relevant. Each class of horror is less killable than the next, where the Elder Gods are the most killable, and then the Great Old Ones being the next most killable, with the Outer Gods being basically truly unkillable. This is true in original Lovecraftian canon and newer Lovecraftian add-ons. I'm going to ignore the mythos of their interactions together because I don't want to go into Lovecraftian canon, because this is a video game channel and not a literary channel, so it doesn't really matter. I will say all three of these classes have no regard for mortal life. When I say they have no regard for mortal life, I don't mean they see us as ants to be squished when we're annoying, although the Outer Gods are incredibly hostile to other forms of life, including other Outer Gods. Instead, the entirety of mortals is like a speck of dust floating through the air. While they barely have any more notice of us than you do of bacteria living on your skin, while you would never notice a single speck of dust in the air, just breathing could change the trajectory of that dust's life forever. And so too is it for cosmic horrors and the mortals. While we have virtually no effect on the horrors, they can influence the minds of mortals without even being aware of our presence. In some stories, they are seen as gods and worshipped by cultists. As time goes on, the lore is expanded by people with their own ideas and aims of what the horrors want, but I'm more concerned about the core of what Lovecraft put forward. Where Darkest Dungeon's core is involved, the genre the game is based on is more important than the traditional story the game presents. Make no mistake, while Lovecraftian stories are generally loved, they are notoriously hard to pull off by any kind of visual media, especially in video games. Telling a Lovecraftian story relies on a primal fear inside of you, a fear of cosmic horrors being out there, something that would make you insane just by looking at them. It's difficult to pull off in visual media because it's hard to keep alive that primal fear when they show up and, well, you're not insane. There have been several renditions of Lovecraftian monsters like Cthulhu, and while they look badass, none of them have made me go insane, I think. I guess I wouldn't know if I went insane, would I? A thought for another time, perhaps. Lovecraftian horror is heavily influential. The monsters are iconic because of how unique they are, as well as how absolute in their power they are. There's a demand for these stories, and not really any quality in the supply. But I would argue that not only is Darkest Dungeon an amazing game, and not only is it an amazing Lovecraftian game, it's one of the best Lovecraftian stories, period. The themes of Lovecraft and what are at the center of why this game is so good are paramount to understanding what this game has achieved. So to recap, from the prologue you immediately get hints of Lovecraftian horror. There is a dense sense of madness with the trademarked tentacles. And this is only the beginning. As you progress through the game, several nefarious characters will need to be disposed of. Even though they exist outside of the confines of the Darkest Dungeon, they pose a threat to all life in the hamlet. As you fight them over and over again, you'll learn while the Darkest Dungeon may have had an influence in their creation, they have all come to power due to the direct actions of your ancestor. Human sacrifice, executions, dirty dealings, and more. Your ancestor is responsible for each and every one of the most nefarious monsters that now corrupts the lands. It will be a while before you have the ability to successfully enter and complete the first mission of the Darkest Dungeon, and by the time you are, you will likely be well acquainted to his descent into madness. However, when you finally finish the first mission of the Darkest Dungeon, you'll start to understand why. Upon completing the first mission, you will gain a new perspective of your surroundings. Vendors, dungeons, allies, and more begin to shift before your very eyes, hinting that while the cruelties you've been hearing about from the tales of your ancestor may have more to do with the darkest dungeon than even he realized, that perhaps he had been influenced by an eldritch being, and not only him, the people of the hamlet, the wildlife surrounding you, and who knows what else. Some of this is confirmed when you finally reach the end game and you meet your ancestor in the flesh. He has given himself over to the eldritch being and will now fight you to protect it. The thing is, by the time you reach this point, most people will think your ancestor's actions are cruel and overall reprehensible. What he's done to the people of the hamlet, what he's become. While he may be affected by an eldritch god, how could he do these things? I think, though, at this point, very few people are thinking or will ever even realize that they too have been thoroughly corrupted by the darkest dungeon. Well, I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself. While the story is a banger, it isn't the main draw of the game. Before I go any further, I need to say I did my playthrough without any DLC installed. I own them all, but I've heard the game is more fun and more interesting with the DLC. In a story-based game like Dragon Age or Spider-Man, I might like having DLC the entire time. But in games that are party-based, I usually try to avoid the DLC on my first playthrough because it changes the dynamic way too much. And I try hard to make sure my first playthrough of a game is as close to the original intent of the developers as possible. With that out of the way, let's get into the best part of the Darkest Dungeon experience. I think that for a lot of people out there, just starting the game is a daunting task in and of itself. It's not a secret that this game can cause epic levels of rage.
God damn it! Who designed this fucking bullshit?
As life ebbs,
Stop it!
terrible vistas of emptiness reveal
What
themselves.
the fuck? Are you serious? What the fuck?
Survival
What the
a
fuck is
tenuous
going on?
proposition in this sprawling
Are you
tomb.
serious?
Or that death and difficulty are rampant. Having played the game, I can say these stories are generally true. Darkest Dungeon can be infuriating. It can be extremely difficult, but that's all a genuine part of the experience. While the level of punishment and difficulty the game presents won't be for everyone, those who do enjoy it will be treated to an encounter that integrates these aspects into every fabric of the game. Also, if you're watching this without playing it for the reasons I just mentioned, while this game is very punishing, it is also extremely forgiving. Very rarely is a mistake something that you have trouble recovering from, and usually only a series of mistakes caused by the inability to admit defeat and give up your expedition results in any real loss, and even that can be recovered from with only mild discomfort. With that, let's talk about the gameplay. When you begin playing Darkest Dungeon, you'll have just received a letter from your ancestor. You will start in a broken down carriage with 2 members of your party. While this is when the game will likely be at its most stressful, the game at this point isn't particularly difficult. This is achieved by the players having knowledge of knowing that at any moment they could lose a character, paired with them being completely ignorant of the different systems of the game, causing the player stress to build with each passing moment. While one of the reasons Darkest Dungeon is held up as a truly unique experience is because you need to maintain your character's mental health while also maintaining their physical health, I think that diminishes the heights this mechanic brings to the table. The game has an in-game meter for each party member's stress. A quick explanation is that as stressful things happen in the game, their stress will build. It can be lowered with soothing actions like motivational speeches and having your dog a whore. Why do you think he was banned, huh? If the stress builds beyond a certain point, it can be detrimental or useful, and if it goes up too high, the character will die. I will explain in more depth in a minute, but this is the basic of the mechanic. The real gem of this mechanic is that it mirrors the player's stress. Health universally goes down as you get hurt. This represents you becoming weaker and weaker. Most detrimental things follow this. It would have been easy to have stress mimic this, but instead, stress goes up Like in real life, your party's stress will build and build, thereby replicating the literal building of the player's stress. If the stress bar on a specific adventurer hits 100, the adventurer will be tested. The mechanic is an excellent example of how games transcend their media. If they fail their test, they become afflicted. This causes them to do negative things and will likely cause the rest of your party to become more stressed, thereby raising the player's stress levels more rapidly as well. This would be similar to breaking under pressure. There is a second outcome though, but it is very rare. If the character passes their test, they will receive a virtuous buff. This causes them to lose half of their stress and will provide sporadic buffs to your party. Doing well under pressure would be an apt comparison to this. There is more to it than that though. You will be aware of this potential outcome of the test while playing, and you will almost never get a virtuous buff. So when a character loses stress and gets a virtuous buff, the mechanic in-game will give the player in real life a noticeable reduction to their stress. The fact that a simple mechanic is able to integrate so well with the experience of the player is a masterful work by the developers, even if it wasn't 100% their intent. Newer characters also have a smaller chance of receiving the virtuous buff and gain more stress than veteran characters. This is a great way for this to work because at the start of the game there is a lot to take in. Once again, the game's mechanics are mirroring the experiences of the player, which is why even though your champions have a low chance of dying, it can still feel like a lot all at once. Stress is an amazing mechanic, and if this was a breakdown of just mechanics, I could go on and on about how much each and every one adds to the experience, but this isn't that video, and there are quite a few mechanics in the game. As time goes on, the player will learn them all. However, equipped with the knowledge that making a mistake can lead to the death of one or more of your very limited pool of characters, leaving an incentive for players to try very hard to understand the game as best as they can, as quickly as they can. This will usually lead to one of two things happening. The first is the player will not care and make simple mistakes, which lead to losing characters very early, causing them to be more careful as time goes on, or quitting, I guess. The second is that players spend a lot of time reading what each effect does and doing their best to understand each and every skill, only for the game to become very easy very quickly, leading to a false sense of security. This false sense of security will eventually lead to losing characters, causing renewed sense of danger, or quitting. So many people quit games before finishing, and I have no idea why. Why are most games' completion achievements at like 10%? So, while you have two different starting styles, they will both likely lead to deaths due to mistakes. This is because even if you're meticulous in reading each skill, it will take a while before each mechanic starts to make sense, in which time you will need to be putting these skills to the test and gaining the experience needed to understand what they do. The percentages, damage calculations, cohesion between classes, and other battle mechanics are not intuitive. Even sitting down and reading everything, the only place to learn is out in the field. It will take time and experience to get a true hold of the game and what skills are necessary for which situations. This is a lot, and we haven't even talked about the out-of-battle mechanics. Without mastery of both battle and non-battle systems, you won't have a chance in the later part of the game. There are different playstyles, and I can't say I know them all, or even I know one of the better ones, but I can say that in my first playthrough, one of the absolute rules I learned fast was that I needed a Vestal for every single run. For those of you who don't know or don't remember the names, I didn't. I had to look up Darkest Dungeon classes and I just played the game. A Vestal is kind of a cleric healer class, and I would have a much easier time when I had one versus when I didn't. The issue with this revelation is that just because I know having one makes the run much easier, that doesn't mean I can have one every run. Recruitment, stress relief, in-game mechanics, and death can all be a hindrance to forming the parties you want to have. The game does its best to get you out of your comfort zone in order to evolve your abilities. That's why I want to spend time explaining some of the mechanics. I did it so that when I talk about the evolution of the gameplay, you'll understand how they feed into the experience. It might seem funny that I spoiled the entire story before the second spoiler warning, but I'm putting my second spoiler warning here. If you continue to watch this video from this point on, you will be losing what's most important to the revelations of the game. Not knowing how to play this game is the most important aspect of this game. so you've been warned. Like I said, you start out with two characters, Dismas and Reynold. They are two different classes, the Crusader and the Highwayman. This game, like others, has different kinds of attacks. While I don't want to give the most basic explanations, there are very important and key features tied to these mechanics, so stick with me if you can. The party is set up in a line, and certain attacks can only be used from certain places in the lineup. And these attacks can only hit certain positions in your enemy's line. So right off the bat, even in the most basic fight mechanics, you need to know and understand each class's movesets to effectively set up a party and place them where they are most effective. While you'll discover each character usually excels in one position or another, you can also change this, as each class has 8 different skills they can learn. But only 4 can be active at one time, so while a Crusader is best in the front 2 positions, they can be set up to be usable in the back 2. So in the end, it'll be up for you to decide how you want to best use a class, and where you want to put them. This isn't the end of just party setup. Enemies can switch positions, and make you switch positions. So while it might benefit you to have a person who excels in slot 1 and only slot 1, if they get kicked back to slot 4, you might have to sacrifice 3 characters' turns to get them back to slot 1 in order to even attack again. This is only the most basic of attack mechanics. However, it will take you many hours of in-game learning to even begin to effectively use these most basic concepts. Like I said earlier, there's a mechanic in the game besides health called stress. I talked about the testing if they hit 100 stress, but now I want to talk more about the afflictions do specifically. If they get an affliction, it will make them refuse healing, cause more stress for the rest of the party members, and just generally do negative actions. There are a couple ways of relieving stress during an expedition, but this mechanic makes taking the same adventure on 2 consecutive missions extremely dangerous. This adds on to the previous mechanic, because you can't even stick with the same characters to learn with them. At the very beginning, you won't have many character slots to work with, and there's no guaranteed way to get the adventurers you want. The only way to even get adventurers is to pick up the ones who arrive at the stagecoach. I said earlier that I felt any party without a designated healer, which for me was the Vestal, had significantly less survivability than every other party combination. The biggest problem with this is the Vestal almost never showed up for me, so I had a couple of options. I could use a Vestal twice in a row and risk their life, and losing a Vestal would mean having no healer for any party, or send a party without a Vestal in it and risk all of their lives. The game at the very beginning has a lot of juggling, and while I think starting again would be a lot easier, that is because of all of the knowledge I have gained. If I hadn't made it clear yet, you will rarely be operating at peak performance. There will always be something keeping you from having everything you need. However, while this is meant to frustrate you, it is also meant to make you a better player. Darkest Dungeon does its best to force you to make the best of a bad situation. I'm not thinking about it philosophically, that's a fact. They say as much each and every time you boot up the game. I doubt you don't know that, but if you're watching an hour-long in-depth video breaking down of Darkest Dungeon and you somehow didn't read the opening message from the devs, this is it. Much of what I've already talked about is exemplified here. Darkest Dungeon is about making the most of a bad situation. Quests will fail or must be abandoned, heroes will die. How far will you push your adventurers? How much are you willing to risk? What will you sacrifice? The wording of this message is one meant to destabilize you at the beginning, but as time goes on, it's meant to serve more as advice than a warning. If something bad happens, it will likely be because you overextended your reach and it resulted in losses. So be careful when deciding what to do, because turning around is always an option. However, even if you do overextend, all is not lost. It's all about making the best of a bad situation when bad situations are plentiful. I've been talking about things like the stress mechanic, not having enough healers, not knowing what the best party builds are, and there's a lot more I didn't cover. Just a handful of examples is not having enough money to relieve stress or upgrade your champions, having too many or too little materials before going on an expedition, quirks, special events, and much more. There's bad situations abound, but Darkest Dungeon is about learning from them and continuing on. A good example is that if when you play games you try to be incredibly safe, before the weeks even hit double digits, you'll find out that you've been spending too much on your expedition supplies. And now your next expedition will be at a disadvantage because your supplies will be severely lacking. If this situation occurs, you will then realize that even though you have way less materials than your last expedition, things weren't that bad. You don't have to use as many torches if you use some light skills. You don't have to pig out when you camp. You virtually never need the debuff items early on, and so on. So you now have the ability to understand that there is a correct amount of supplies to bring on an expedition. And figuring this out immediately makes every other issue easier to manage because now you have more money. I said I learned early on I needed a healer for everything, but not having a healer is important, because it teaches you how to maximize the healing potential of your attack classes. It makes you notice who is the most dangerous on the enemy team. You can fail a quest because you didn't have a healer and still be better off than if you had completed the quest with the healer. When the stagecoach doesn't give you a class you want and instead gives you a class you have to take because otherwise you're going to need to bring in an adventurer with 100 stress and risk their life, it makes you learn that class. There are classes I didn't use until the end of the game because I didn't want to learn them. I kicked myself for this because one of them was so good. I was an idiot for not having them in all my parties beforehand. It's about making mistakes and continuing on after them. I didn't mention this before in the video, but this game has autosaves for every action you take. So every run through is an Iron Man mode. Don't let this dissuade you though. You're going to pull through. The only way you can lose is by quitting. One thing that's been noted by some people who've played the game is it's actually extremely hard to reach an unrecoverable game state organically. You can always make some kind of comeback. As time goes on, knowledge you've gained will come into play more and more, and losing characters will become very rare. Eventually, the game will go from making the best of a bad situation to making the best of a mild inconvenience to avoiding bad situations altogether. From the sacrifices of your comrades, you'll build a strong foundation of knowledge on their corpses, and it'll pave the way to stronger and more well-equipped adventurers. Eventually, you'll have exact copies of your favorite adventurers, and different party loadouts for different types of fights. Speaking from personal experience, my favorite setup was the Hellion in the front, then the Crusader, then the Vestal, and in the back, the Plague Doctor. The Hellion can stun and hit the front two spots, and the fourth spot, my Crusader can stun and hit the front two, but except for dire situations, he's just my stress healer. Then my Vestal is the main healer, and the Plague Doctor can constantly apply Blight as well as cure it. That's not my only loadout, but it's by far my favorite. Learning and progressing doesn't have to be rushed either. You can take your time and learn as much as you want. There's no time limit in the game. The Darkest Dungeon exists, but you can take as much or as little time as you want. The only mechanic that even sort of pushes you into more difficult fights is the Resolve mechanic. The Resolve mechanic will make your parties look down on missions below their skill level. There are 3 different skill levels: Novice, Veteran, and Champion. You can do missions above your level, but not below it. This is the mechanic that forced me in the late game to play with the class I never touched before I mentioned earlier. It's another way of helping force you into picking characters you might not be comfortable with, but can, from time to time, give you upgrades to current party loadouts that you weren't expecting. As you progress through the game and do more difficult expeditions, you'll eventually have bosses you can fight. The bosses have 3 difficulty levels. By that I mean you have to fight each boss in 3 different expeditions before they are vanquished. They are all technically optional, but if you do fight them, you'll have great rewards, so it's almost always worth it. Their lowest difficulty encounter really isn't that bad, but you can still have issues if you're having a lot of trouble getting a foothold in the game. The lowest level bosses can usually have their mechanics completely ignored if you're in a good position. Thing is, most people will just kind of power through, and that's the same with all of the early expeditions. Like I said, the game isn't difficult at the beginning, just complicated. It's easy to make simple mistakes early, which forces you to be more careful to ensure that you don't lose anyone, but it's not particularly hard. This is a smokescreen though. Most people will feel comfortable by the time they reach the bosses, and how easy they are reinforces this moving forward. This misdirection will cause you trouble later on. Bosses outside of their first difficulty can be extremely deadly. If you don't pay very close attention to their specific mechanics, you will regret it when you fight their second difficulty, and you can't know that when you're just starting. For example, killing Wilbur in the Swine Prince fight means nothing to you, but doing that when fighting the Swine King will almost surely wipe your party, and I doubt there will have been more than a few people who finished the Swine God fight if they killed Wilbur first. Going in with the Plague Doctor for certain fights is super good, but he's useless if they have too much blight resistance. Some bosses will have significant stress building abilities, but all do something that needs to be accounted for. The thing is, you won't know how hard a fight is or what it requires until you fight it. Fighting them just to find out how strong they are can be very dangerous though. It wouldn't be surprising to get an entire party wiped without knowing how to fight a boss. It sucks, but that's part of the process. Once you understand why a boss is so strong, you can work on how to avoid or diminish that strength by using what you learned and prepare accordingly. When I would fight a boss expedition, I would try and run directly to them, ignoring all alternative pathways. While you don't know exactly where the boss is, most boss fights are just literally at the farthest point away from the beginning of the dungeon. Once I reached the room right before the boss, I would set up camp, give my party as many buffs as I could, then it would fight them, obviously trying to win, but mostly trying to make sure I wouldn't lose. During the fight, I would take note of everything that could help me make the fight easier. Check what resistance they had, what their gimmicks were. Did I need Blight Heal? Did I need a ranged attacker? What party did I think could best fight them? These are all questions I would try and answer before beating them or running. It's also best to do this on their second difficulty, because I knew party members getting out alive would be much more difficult on their final difficulty. Based on how this game is set up, I think this isn't an uncommon way to approach the boss fights, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if most people played this way. In fact, if you don't use a guide, I'm almost positive that this is the way most people will play, whether they want to or not, because throwing whatever you can at the boss will just get your party wiped. So you'll be forced to either gain information or die. There may be parties that are strong enough that they can kill any boss no matter what, but you're not going to know this on your first playthrough. The devs have crafted this game to be played like this. The reason why I'm sure of this is because the Darkest Dungeon makes this exact way of playing even harder. The Darkest Dungeon, the namesake of the game, and the most intimidating challenge of the entire game. While it is a momentous challenge, there's no set time you need to enter it by, and no requirements to enter it. In fact, you can enter it as soon as you reach the hamlet, but this is inadvisable. If you enter the Darkest Dungeon unprepared, at least one person will die, and what is more likely, your entire party will perish. You're more or less ready to enter the Darkest Dungeon around the time you've got a party of max resolve adventurers. By this time, you'll have fought at least one champion stage boss, and you'll have taken on most of what this game has to offer. So it's Final Dungeon time. As long as you apply the knowledge you've gained, it's just another place. When you're finally ready to set out, you'll get your favorite adventurers together. Make sure they are as upgraded as your current hamlet amenities will allow, gear them up with the best trinkets you have, make sure they have no diseases or negative quirks that you don't want, and do your best to gain some information. Make sure that everyone comes back alive. That's right. The Darkest Dungeon is the extreme of everything I've talked about up to this point. It's not just stronger enemies. Going in only to gain information without any intention of beating it costs the life of one of your adventurers no matter what. So while in the previous dungeons losing someone to do some scouting was a possibility, in the Darkest Dungeon, if you send in a scouting team, one of your adventurers is not coming back. However, sending your best party in without knowing what the Darkest Dungeon holds could cause your entire A-team to get wiped out. I want to bring to your attention that when you fight champion level bosses, your entire party coming back to the hamlet alive isn't guaranteed, even with complete knowledge of the encounter. And in the spirit of that, when it comes to the Darkest Dungeon, you will have nothing to base the expeditions off of. While in the boss fights, you had knowledge of previous encounters from the novice level to at least somewhat understand what was going on. So what should you do? Send in your best party and hope they all make it back alive, possibly losing every single one of your best characters? or send in a scouting team at the cost of at least one of their lives. The correct answer is the scouting team. This is a revelation you will have after 1 or 2 trips into the Darkest Dungeon. There is a trade-off for the extreme spike in difficulty the Darkest Dungeon presents. The dungeon is static. If you've never played Darkest Dungeon before, one of the roguelite elements of the game is procedurally generated dungeons. When you're progressing through the game, what you'll learn is something like how many torches you need for a short versus a long. Specifics of a particular boss that you will learn are something like, what are the special attacks of the boss? Maybe something you can learn is the resistances of the enemies in the dungeon. These are general rules and guidelines for adventuring, because the dungeons are never the same 2 expeditions in a row. The Darkest Dungeon isn't like this. You can learn everything about the Darkest Dungeon quest before completing it, and that knowledge will persist the next time you enter it. When you progress to the Darkest Dungeon, the map layout, the enemies, what room they are in, and how many there are, this is all set in stone. You will always fight the same enemies in the same rooms. The rooms will always be laid out in the same way, and so on. Every bit of knowledge you gather will help too. For example, the Darkest Dungeon's debuffs and damage effects bleed and blight hurt a lot more than any other dungeon. The other thing is that the dungeon has no treasure chests, no obstacles, and way less hunger checks than other dungeons. So while other dungeons have you getting rid of items for treasure and heirlooms, you won't have to here. Also, when in other dungeons you'd want keys and shovels to make your way through, you won't need those to take up slots with you here. Equipped with that knowledge, you know the only items you need to bring are torches, food, and healing items. So while the bleed and blight hurt like hell, you have way more antidotes than any other dungeon, as long as you know you can bring them in without worrying. However, that doesn't mean that the dungeon is easy, yet. The bosses have very special mechanics, and without preparing for, will give you a shit ton of issues. The first boss, for example, will shuffle your party. If you don't have adventurers who can excel in every position, he will be impossible to take out. It's not just the bosses either. The enemies give way more stress than any other, and like I said, the debuffs hit way harder now. The point I'm trying to make is that while doing a scouting mission in the Darkest Dungeon is more dangerous here than anywhere else, the information is much more valuable than anywhere else. You can actually change your forays from an unknowable hellscape to a walk in the park. To explain exactly what I mean, here is a map of the first dungeon. You can see every single encounter on this map. You only have to fight as little as 9 times in total. You don't need any shovels or keys, and you won't pick up any treasure unless you want to get the one chest in the middle. You can prepare your exact party to encounter the exact enemies here. Looking at the fights here, we know exactly what enemies are going to be in which fights. So even if one of these fights is particularly hard, you can go an alternative way and maybe have more fights, but it'll be easier. You'll be able to bring full bandages, blight antidotes, and debuff healers you weren't bringing before. I don't know if I'm the only one, but I didn't really bring any status ailment remedies when I was going through the regular dungeons. Not even when I was preparing for the highest level dungeons. I would just get rid of them for treasures later. And the fights weren't that hard, so why bother? In the Darkest Dungeon, there were several fights where I could have lost a party member to bleed if I didn't have a bandage. I can't stress enough how much knowledge diminishes the difficulty of the Darkest Dungeon. Knowledge diminished all difficulty of the game, but how hard the Darkest Dungeon in comparison to everything else cannot be understated. However, there is a cost to this knowledge, like I said. In order to know that the fights are 100% static, which is completely different from any other dungeon you've seen, and is counter to the roguelite genre, you need to go into the same quest of the Darkest Dungeon at least twice. You won't know this the first time, how could you? By the second time, you might not be paying close enough attention to the landscape to know what's happening. That's at least 2 adventurers gone if you don't finish, and potentially many more. And these aren't just low-level adventurers. These are probably maxed out adventurers with full skill upgrades, max equipment upgrades, locked in good quirks, and capped resolved, all sacrificed. However, these sacrifices can be mitigated. Once you know the dungeons are static, you don't have to send in your best parties. You don't need to sacrifice the strongest. After all, you just have to gain some knowledge. You can build an expedition party, at least one of them will be lost, but that's just the nature of the Darkest Dungeon. The dungeon's quests get harder, so expect to send more lambs to the slaughter. As you get more used to it, the Darkest Dungeon goes from a truly scary place to a known equation. This shift over time is probably huge for most people. When you first start playing, and even up to this very moment, you will be scared of the Darkest Dungeon. Every time you look at it, you might be afraid of what you might find there. I know when I first started, I was expecting that inside of the dungeon would be where I lost everything. It turns out that just knowing what's in there will greatly reduce the difficulty of the entire thing. Reaching the end of the Darkest Dungeon will no longer be impossible. The more you know, the more you can do. Darkest Dungeon is a game about making the best out of a bad situation, but more than that, it's a game about gaining the knowledge required to move forward. The Darkest Dungeon has twists and turns, but in the end, you've turned the scariest dungeon into nothing more than any other expedition. And all it cost you was your sanity. In a game based off Lovecraftian lore, the loss of madness is practically inevitable. But most people will think the scenery changing in the game is a representation of that, because it's not done very well in previous games. I would argue that is wrong. I believe the game is centered about forcing the player to become insane within the confines of the game. Some of you might have guessed that I was headed here. I didn't exactly hide it. This is why I first started by telling you about your ancestors' fall into madness, and effectively spoiled the story before even telling you about the game. There was a reason you needed to understand the core of Lovecraftian horror before we talked about the game itself. It is why I wanted to talk about the acquisition of knowledge, and more importantly, the rising cost of that knowledge that you were more and more willing to pay. The final boss is a cosmic horror. The Heart of Darkness would seem to be an embryo of an egg, the planet itself. It has been affecting your mind all this time. The loss of sanity will be a hard sell to some of you, but consider how scared you were to lose any adventure at the beginning. When did losing them become acceptable? When did they become expendable? How worried were you when you needed to fight your first boss? When did these monstrous enemies become just checkboxes to you? When did you stop caring about how fucked up your ancestor was? I believe this game is the perfect representation of what having an eldritch being affect you would be like. You start off scared and apprehensive to do something that might lead to the loss of life. But by the end, you are grooming sets of adventurers to send into the dungeon where they might all perish, just to learn a little bit more about it. Make no mistake, at the end of the game, you're sitting on a throne made of the corpses of your adventurers. The game has caused you to walk down the path of your ancestor. You set out to close the Darkest Dungeon, but now you're sacrificing your friends to it just to learn more about it. The reason you are sacrificing them isn't important. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. The siren, the swine, the brigand, these are all stories that may have felt uncomfortable listening to because they were a glimpse into your ancestors' madness. Uncomfortable stories of your ancestor treating people's lives like garbage and causing suffering wherever he went, only to end up with you doing the same thing. The only difference between you two is that he didn't know what happened to those who sought out the Darkest Dungeon. You did. There is a moment at the end of the game where you're talking to your ancestor and he says this:
In all my terrible researches, what I sought was a glimpse behind the veil, a crumb of cosmic truth. I found it here, and in that moment of brain-blasting realization, I ceased to be a man, and became a herald, an avatar of the crawling chaos.
And then he goes on to say,
We are chained here forever, you and I, at the end of the world. Free yourself, Rouse the thing and embrace the ineffable cosmic hideousness that lives within us all.
These quotes are at the heart of what Darkest Dungeon is and why it was so good. What I believe he's saying here is when he reached this point before you, he realized what had happened to him. He understood the evils he had wrought and made no excuses for what he did. He believes the evil that drove his actions and that got you here is an evil within us all. He came to the conclusion that instead of fighting it, we should embrace it. For a moment, the game has given you a glimpse of what having a mind consumed by madness is like. Your own mind at this point has reached the point of insanity. And while you are likely going to kill the heart of darkness, you have felt what it is like to lose yourself. To be affected by the cosmic horrors of the Lovecraftian tales, and even better, to see what it's like to have yourself fill the shoes of someone you had previously found despicable. Now, you might disagree, but there are some pieces of evidence that really set this into stone for me. One of them is the fail state of the hardest difficulty. The hardest difficulty has a limit of deaths before the game is lost. It's actually the only way to truly lose Darkest Dungeon. If you've beaten the game, you'll know the last line of the game is the same as the first.
Ruin has come to our family.
That's because once you defeat the Heart of Darkness, the Ancestor calls another traveler to the hamlet. The Ancestor is basically saying you can't stop the coming of the Heart of Darkness. It will awake. So most people will inherently attach the text to the game over screen of the hardest difficulty to the awakening of the monster. I think this is a fair understanding, but I'd like to pitch an alternative. I believe this game over signifies when your characters reach their mental breaking point. It is at this point that they become beholden to the Heart of Darkness and are truly and wholly insane. There is no fantastic cutscene in which one already exists of the heart's awakening. There is no long drawn-out speech, just a message stating that death has accelerated its rebirth. While this message can be taken as it has awakened, I think it means that the heart's consciousness has stirred, and when an eldritch thing stirs, their influence tends to break mortals that are connected to them. There is also the possibility you never engaged in this research. By that, I mean you use the wiki or some guide or something. But that doesn't mean you were exempt from the madness either. If you read a guide, you are canonically still sacrificing others, even if you won't do it yourself. Like I said, canonically, every playthrough has happened. Once you defeat the Heart of Darkness, the Ancestor sends out another letter to another fresh adventurer. People have been sacrificed for the knowledge that created the map I showed you. It just so happens you weren't willing to do the dirty work yourself. I'm not arguing that using a guide makes you a worse person. That's not what this is about. I am just pointing out that no one is exempt from the madness of the Darkest Dungeon. We have all willingly sacrificed people's lives in order to complete the game at some point. You might also say that I'm looking too much into this, but honestly, the lines from your Ancestor really drive this point home, with one in particular digging the entirety of its way into what I've said. When accessing the guild hall, one line in particular drives it all the way home.
Some may fall, but their knowledge lives on.
I've already talked about this, but I want to really draw your attention to the major shift that occurs when you enter the Darkest Dungeon. When you're playing through, you are aware that the Darkest Dungeon is a penultimate dungeon, and you will be worried about what might happen there the entire time you're heading in. It just so happens that shortly after you enter is right when you're no longer afraid of it. The experience has been tailored to be like this. There is nothing different about the Darkest Dungeon before and after you enter it. The only thing that is different is you. You have changed once you've entered it. And if the subtle difference of tone you have towards the Darkest Dungeon isn't proof enough, the game literally changes what you see. As you go about the game, locations, adventurers, and shopkeepers will appear different for split seconds of time. This also just so happens to be when you start feeling more comfortable. You're sacrificing your adventurers, and this just happens to be when the Heart of Darkness has finally started affecting you the strongest. Whether you believe this is intentional or not doesn't matter, because in the end, this is what makes the Darkest Dungeon stand out among other games. This goes back to the basis of what Lovecraftian stories are about. In the beginning of this video, I talked about when I saw Cthulhu and how cool he was and that I didn't go insane. And then I talked about not knowing if I've gone insane or not. When you look at the heart of darkness, you should be going insane unless you already are. This game pulls off a degradation of sane values in the player by having them make sacrifices willingly when initially they would have completely been against it. You may not specifically want a person to die, but when you accept the death as a fact before even setting out to a dungeon, the game has achieved what few forms of media before it have: a manifestation of madness in the viewer. What a game Darkest Dungeon is, huh? It was honestly an amazing experience, and I really loved the in-game mechanics. What originally made me fall in love with the game is how it forces you to switch your characters up. I knew I wanted to make a video on it because of that alone. It wasn't until your ancestor said embrace the infallible cosmic hideousness that lives within us all that I knew what this video was going to be about though. When I heard that line, the topic of the video immediately manifested itself, and basically, the script wrote itself in my mind. It gets exciting when a game is such an amazing layer hidden beneath the surface. And I knew I had to talk about this layer. And well, when you know, you know. I love the stress and rage the game induces. I didn't talk about this much, but I'd get so fucking mad when someone would come out of nowhere and crit one of my people for all of their HP. Ridiculous. There were also really high highs though. I remember pretty early on I lost a Vestal, my best Vestal in fact. And I knew I wanted to get this part on video, but I couldn't fit it anywhere. The part I wanted in the video was when I was able to resurrect her. This was an in-game event, and that was such an amazing feeling. That was such a high when it happened. It was crazy. I will say my one regret is that when I played the game, I played on the darkest difficulty. I should have played it on the hardest setting. The game got relatively easy for me towards the end, and I should have just jumped in the deep end when I started. Games like this are really, really good, and I usually enjoy them more the more carefully I have to handle the experience. And Darkest was difficult, but a lot of my losses at the start were just due to carelessness. My first death in the game also took place during my first party wipe. I idiotically used a torch on an Eldritch altar at the very end of a dungeon without knowing what would happen. It was an easy and avoidable wipe, and honestly, super lame. I would have been a lot more careful in a harder difficulty. It's kind of the moment the game went from really easy to moderately difficult for a time, because I lost a lot of my stronger characters. Luckily for me, it was a backup party, so I still had the A-team, and I actually never lost them all the way to the end of the game. I think the more dumb mistake you make, the more the game's robustness has a chance to shine. I hope you enjoy this deep dive. If you like thought-provoking, difficult games, I suggest throwing me a sub. My next video should be on difficulty in video games, and I like to talk about games that really have a deeper meaning in their mechanics. Well, till next time, bye-bye.
You remember our venerable house? Ruin has come to our family.